Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. President, for the recognition, and I want to speak today to share my concerns over proposed changes in the estate and gift tax provisions of the current tax code. And that's going to be considered within hours here on the floor. Like much of the tax code, the estate and gift tax provisions are terribly complex, costly to comply with, have very serious negative consequences. And these negative consequences, I think, disproportionately harm farmers and ranchers and worry their lenders. Visit with farmers and stockmen today, livestock producers, you better stand back. They are upset, they're frustrated, they're angry, they're concerned, and they're worried. All across farm country, we are suffering from a severe drought, which is a real emergency, historic in scope and damage, in particular for our livestock industry. Congress should respond. At the same time, they are facing a farm bill that's in limbo, regulations that defy any common sense cost-benefit yardstick, and no farmer or their lender can plan in this environment. There is no certainty. In farm country, there is no certainty. But just to split the shingle, Mr. President, now we have proposed changes to the current estate tax, the infamous death tax, if you will, all based, again, on a select few in Washington deciding who is wealthy, what's a fair share people should pay in a tax, and how you should pay that tax, playing again with the politics of envy and class warfare. I think we ought to quit this business. And the classic example is that under current law, the federal estate tax is set at 35% on estates over $5 million. If nothing has changed on January 1, 2013, or if you vote for a particular version of these two tax bills that we're going to be considering here in just about an hour and a half, if nothing has changed, the estate tax exemption will drop from $5 million to $1 million, and the estate tax rate will jump from 35% to 55%. Mr. President, if we do not act to extend the current death tax structure, I'd like to eliminate it, I'd like to repeal it, but at least extend it. The Joint Committee on Taxation reports that over 10 years, the number of small businesses subject to the death tax would increase from about 1,800 folks to 23,700, and the number of farming estates subject to the death tax would increase from about 900 farmers and ranchers to 25,200. That's more than 20 times additional farming estates that would be hit with this massive death tax hike, a 2,000% increase. And it's just not farms and ranchers that would be affected. 9 times more small businesses would be hit with this massive death tax, a 900% increase. 12 times more taxable estates would be hit, a 1,200% increase. Now, Mr. President, while I support permanently repealing the death tax, if we cannot achieve that goal, how we structure this tax in particular has immediate real-world implications for folks in Kansas and across the country. The looming 2013 change to the estate tax law would be a huge disservice to agriculture because it is a land-based, capital-intensive industry. Few options for paying estate taxes when they come due. The current state of our economy, coupled with the uncertain nature of estate tax liabilities, makes it tremendously difficult for family-owned farms and ranchers to make any sound business decisions. They're on the sidelines of our economy. They're not on the economic playing field. Again, there is no certainty. Obviously, raising the estate tax burden will strike a blow to farm and ranch operations trying to transition from one generation to the next. A $1 million exemption, that sounds like a lot. to some people in this chamber, and obviously to some people within this administration, $1 million, you're rich, you're wealthy. No consideration as to what the personal situation is for that individual, but somebody just determining what a fair share is, and then taking from that individual and redistributing to those that they think deserve it. But a $1 million exemption is not high enough to protect a typical farm or ranch able to support a family, and when coupled with a top rate of 55%, that's going to be especially difficult, if not impossible, for farmers and ranches and businesses to pass on their wherewithal to the next generation. Yet our nation's estate tax policy is in direct conflict with a desire to preserve and protect our nation's family-owned farms and ranches. Individuals, family partnerships, and family corporations own 98% of our nation's 2 million farms and ranches. When estate taxes on an agriculture business exceed cash or other liquid assets, many surviving family partners will be forced to sell land, buildings, or equipment needed to keep their businesses operating. With 85% of farm and ranch assets illiquid, why producers have few options when it comes to generating cash to pay the estate tax. And recent increases in agriculture land values, on average 25% from 2010 to 2011, have greatly expanded the number of farms and ranchers that now top the estate tax exemption. How on earth can farmers, ranchers, and small businesses even plan for this? In order to keep a farm or ranch businesses operating after the death of the owner, families must plan for the estate tax. But under the majority party bill we will vote on shortly, many more farmers and ranchers will face increased filing, paperwork, other hassles in planning for succession, not to mention lawyers and CPAs and estate planners. In fact, if we don't extend the current estate tax, the states required to file paperwork for the IRS rise from about 8,600 to 107,500. That's a lot of time and cost that could be avoided. The planning costs associated with this tax are not only a drain on business resources, but also take money away from the day-to-day operations and investing in the business. Even with planning, uncertain tax law combined with changing land values and family situations make it impossible to guarantee that an estate plan will protect a family farm or ranch. This not only can cripple a farm or ranch operation, but it hurts all throughout all of our rural communities, up and down Main Street, every business that agriculture supports. The death tax is one of the worst offenders in bringing real complexity to the tax code. And I believe it is one of the most distortive provisions in our system. Now, some believe and will point out that the estate tax is an instrument of social justice, that it is designed to limit wealth accumulation and to spread that wealth around, something I think that is contrary to what this country is all about. Why do you work? Well, you work hard to make a difference, and you work hard because you enjoy the work, and hopefully you get paid for it, and hopefully you get paid for it enough that you can at least have enough wherewithal so that your kids and their kids can continue that kind of endeavor if they so choose. But some people say we want to spread that wealth around. Even if you hold what I consider a socialistic view, tough word, it's a pejorative, I know, but I think that applies here. The estate tax, which distorts no end of economic decisions, isn't the most efficient method to redistribute the wealth. If you are a wealth redistributor, if you will, in this body, clearly taxpayers facing the death tax respond to the tax, cutting back on investments, consuming more of the capital, other assets that could be passed on to build businesses. So the disincentives the death tax creates in the end leads to lower growth, fewer jobs, less savings. How do you redistribute that? There's nothing to redistribute. In a troubled economy, this forced outcome just does not make sense. Mr. President, being able to plan for the future is critical. The current uncertainty leads to the repeated revisions of wills and trusts, which burdens taxpayers and advisors alike, over and over again. I don't care what farm organization you're talking to, what commodity group, what business group, what small business group, wherever you go, in my state of Kansas, and I think it's the same in regards to other states that members here are privileged to represent. Over and over again, I've been asked again what Congress will do with these provisions. What should a rancher do? How can they pass farms on to their children? I have even been asked for planning purposes, I'm not making this up, if this is a good year to die. That's astounding, if not outrageous. It may be a good year to die because this egregious change is going nowhere. These two bills that we are considering here in just a few moments, they're not going anywhere. We will vote on it in a little while, but it's subject both to a point of order, not having originated in the House. They will be blue-slipped. That's a fancy word. It's a parliamentary word saying they're going nowhere because bills on taxes have to originate in the House. Talk about a real income redistribution nothing burger. Boy, that's what we're considering. But it is indicative of what is being considered here in this chamber and indicative of what we have to take care of in true tax reform. Now, folks in Kansas should not have to make such important decisions on a tax law that's changing all the time. We need to repeal or permanently set the death tax. If this tax cannot be repealed, it needs to be set in stone, hopefully not a gravestone, and at a rate and in a manner that provides certainty. Now, while it's important to permanently eliminate this very punitive tax, until this can be accomplished, Congress should at least extend the current $5 million exemption, indexing it to reflect land values, and continuing the spousal transfer and maintaining the top 35% tax rate. Finally, Mr. President, we pay taxes all of our lives. It just doesn't make sense to be taxed again when we die. I suggest the absence of a quorum, although I know my colleague from Illinois is perhaps ready to speak, and I will be happy to yield back any time that I have.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague from Kansas for yielding. Mr. President, in a short time we're going to vote on a tax measure that gives the United States Senate a very clear choice, and here's the choice. At the end of this year, a whole battery of tax cuts that were enacted into law years ago will expire, December 31st. And the question is, what's going to happen next? If we do nothing, a very good thing will happen, but also a very bad thing will happen. The good thing is this. If the taxes go up on all Americans, virtually all Americans, for 10 years, we will reduce our deficit by $5 trillion, more than any group has been able to suggest or come up with a plan to achieve in any of the meetings that we've been involved in. $5 trillion in deficit reduction. It's an amazing reduction. But there's another side to the ledger. And the other side of the ledger says, if you start taxing families now, while this economy is in recovery, it's going to slow down the recovery. Well, that's natural. People have less money to spend. And many families, working families, living paycheck to paycheck, will face a new hardship that they don't have today. They reduce their spending, the economy contracts, and we see this recession hang on with high unemployment and businesses failing. So it really is a very Faustian choice, a difficult choice. Reduce the deficit dramatically on one hand by letting all the tax cuts expire, but run the risk of going even into a deeper recession, maybe repeating what just happened a few years ago, which devastated our economy. So the President has said, let's try to strike the right balance here. When all the tax cuts expire on December 31st, let's focus on restoring the tax cuts for that portion of American families and workers who need a helping hand to continue. But let's not go all the way. Let's not restore the tax cuts for those in the highest income categories. And so the President says we can have both. If you follow my plan, we will reduce the budget deficit because we don't give tax cuts to the wealthiest, and still in all will help working families and will keep the economy moving forward. He tries to strike that balance, and the balance he strikes is at the income level of $250,000. So everyone will get a tax cut on the first $250,000 of income, even millionaires, but not beyond that. The Republicans have a different approach, and they'll offer an amendment, extend all the tax cuts for everybody to the highest levels of income, well beyond $250,000, not just to the 98% of Americans who make $250,000 or less, but 100%, everybody. Well, their approach, by extending those tax cuts, will mean no deficit reduction. In fact, their approach would add about $900 billion to the deficit compared to the president's approach. So they are really basically throwing a bucket of red ink on this conversation, saying we're prepared to add $900 billion to the deficit so that the top 2% of wage earners can get a tax break. But that isn't all. The Republican approach, which will be offered by Senator Hatch, the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, goes a step further. I don't understand this part of it. He wants to extend the tax cuts to the highest income categories, Mr. President, but then he very carefully excises, eliminates some of the basic tax breaks that working families use. Let me be specific. The Hatch bill, the Hatch-McConnell bill, Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, does not extend the earned income tax credit, child tax credit provisions, and as a result, here's what happens. The Hatch provision, which protects the wealthiest in America by saving their tax cut, would increase the tax on 11 million working families in America who currently are able to deduct the college tuition expenses of their kids. So while the wealthiest in America will get a break all the way through with the Hatch-McConnell Republican approach, 11 million American families will find their tax bills going up if they have kids in college. What kind of message is that? Here are the students struggling to get through school, families incurring debt. We create a tax benefit to help those families get through, and the Republicans say no. We're going to raise the taxes on 11 million working families. That isn't all. They also raise the taxes on 6 million other families, working families with 3 or more children, by $800 each on a change that they refuse to make in the earned income tax credit, and then turn around, and this I think is one of the worst. They increase the taxes on families with children. The child tax credit currently in the law allows a break for families with kids, a helping hand, because kids can be expensive. And this is part of the tax code that helps these families. So 18 million American families will see their taxes go up with the Hatch-McConnell Republican tax approach that protects those at the highest level of income categories. I don't think that's sensible. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years talking about this deficit. It's serious. I guess I come from the Democratic side of the spectrum, the left side of the spectrum. That's what my values reflect, and that's my voting record reflects. But I'll tell you this Democratic senator understands deficits are for real. We cannot continue to borrow 40 cents for every dollar we spend, even for the programs I love, let alone the programs I'm not so crazy about. And so we've got to reduce spending. But you can't balance the budget with millions of Americans out of work. We need to get this economy growing and moving forward and creating jobs. People working and paying taxes make this a strong country and start to solve some of our deficit problems just by virtue of the fact that they're working, paying their taxes, and raising their families. And so when it comes to these tax cuts, let me tell you, I am passionate about making certain that working families get the break they need. Pew Trust did a survey, Mr. President, last year, and here's what they asked working families across America. Real basic question. If you had a family emergency and you needed $2,000 in 30 days, could you get it? Could you come up with $2,000? If there's a major car repair or a pretty routine trip to the hospital or to a doctor's office, That can run into $2,000 in a hurry. Broken arm, or you consider the possibilities. So they ask all the working families, how many of you could come up with $2,000 in 30 days? Half. Half of the working families. It means the other half can't. It tells you how close to the edge many people are living. And that's why the President's proposal, the Democratic proposal here, that gives the tax cuts and tax breaks to the working families makes a difference. 98% of Americans will benefit from the President's approach. 2% will pay more. 2%, I think, will pay their fair share. The Republican approach means for a millionaire, a person making $1 million in a year, and just some quick math, that's $20,000 a week in income, $1 million a year. The Republican approach would give them a $250,000 annual tax break. Come on. At this moment in time, when we're dealing with the deficit and we're calling on Congress for more spending cuts and we're saying we've got to get it together as a nation, $250,000 a year in additional tax cuts for millionaires? I don't get it. I don't begrudge them their wealth. This country is based on successful people who've led us in business and so many other endeavors. But I also think those people, when you talk to them, are darned appreciative to live in this great country and willing to help it move forward. And then they make the argument, well, wait a minute, if you raise taxes on people making $1 million a year, you're going to hit a lot of the, quote, business creators. Well, we looked at that. 97% of small business owners are exempt if you draw the line to $250,000 of income. 97%. Now, I'll concede. There are professional corporations and S-corps, investment fund managers, some accountants, some lawyers, some doctors. Sure, they may be job creators. I don't doubt that. But are we really asking a great sacrifice from someone making $1 million a year not to get a tax break to the full extent that they did before? I think what we understand is if we're going to help the middle class and working families in America and we're going to move the economy forward, we need a sensible tax policy. Now, I happen to be of a school that maybe not all the Democrats agree with. On the Simpson-Bowles Commission, I was one who said the only way to deficit reduction is to put everything on the table. Everything, including the programs that I think are critically important for America's future. I think Medicare makes a difference in the lives of 40 million plus Americans, and I want it to be there. And I know it's going to run out of money in 11 years. Think of that. We don't do a thing here. We get caught in political gridlock. The Medicare program that 40 million Americans plus depend on is going to run out of money. What excuse are we going to come up with? There is no excuse. We need to sit and look at this program, make it work, make sure that it's affordable for seniors, and we've got to do it sooner rather than later. Social Security. You hear so much about Social Security. Let's get the facts out. For at least the next 24 years, Social Security is going to make every promised payment to every retiree in America with a cost of living adjustment, no questions asked. 24 years. Can't say that about many, if any, federal programs. But the 25th year, we're in trouble. We have a drop-off in revenue in the Social Security Trust Fund, and the payments would have to be cut 30%. Now, if you're wealthy in retirement, some people are, Social Security check is just like a little extra dividend. But for some people, it really means whether they're going to get by for another month. And a 30% cut's unacceptable. So we need to look at Social Security. It doesn't add a penny to the deficit, but the Social Security Trust Fund needs to be stronger longer. We need a bipartisan approach to this. We did it 50 years ago. We can do it now. We need to sit down and make sure that it works. We shouldn't decide that this is out of bounds. That's something we need to consider. It won't be voted on today, neither Medicare nor Social Security. We're just dealing with the tax side of this conversation. But I happen to believe all of these things need to be discussed. And when it comes to taxes, I'm pretty basic on that. I want to make sure that working families have a tax code that helps them. Last week we had a bill. Think about this for a second. We had a bill on the floor of the Senate, and here's what it said. Currently, the tax code creates incentives and rewards American businesses that want to ship jobs overseas. American businesses that want to outsource and ship jobs overseas, the tax code says, we'll give you a break. you'll pay less taxes if you send jobs away. That makes no sense at all. Why would we reward the export of American jobs? Why would we provide for the deductibility of moving expenses and other expenses related to moving your business out of America and hiring people in another country? So last week, Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio came to the floor and said, let us eliminate the tax incentive to move jobs overseas, and let's turn it around. Let's create a tax incentive for businesses that want to bring jobs back to America. Sounds right to me, doesn't it? That we're creating jobs in this country and discouraging them from going overseas. In the end, we had all the Democrats voting for it and only four out of the 47 Republicans. 4. Not enough to break the Republican filibuster. When we talk about a tax code, I not only want to help working families, I want to provide an incentive and reward for those good, home-based American corporations that are trying to keep good-paying jobs right here in the United States of America. Honest to goodness, if we want to walk into a store and pick up a product, flip it over and see made in the USA, we better wake up. Currently, what's going on is unacceptable. This notion on the Republican side of the aisle that we shouldn't get in the way of business when they want to make their decisions. I may not argue with that premise, but I don't think you ought to incentivize it, subsidize it, provide something in the tax code to encourage it, particularly when it costs American jobs. But last week, only four of the 47 Republicans would join us in that effort. So we came up short. This week, we've got to get it right when it comes to our tax code in the future and tax cuts for the families across America. Mr. President, one of the things that has worried me greatly as I consider the challenges facing families is their inability to provide for their kids in the way they want to. I think we all know the expenses of raising children. We all know what families face when the kids are off to college. And we know some of the challenges they face after college. Well, we have come up with an approach which I think is sensible. A child tax credit for the young kids, a deduction of college education expenses for those who made it to that level of education, and then part of what is some call derisively Obamacare says that families can keep their kids on their own health insurance, family health insurance, until those young men and women reach the age of 26. That makes sense. How many young people coming out of college today struggle to find a job, and if they find one, struggle to find a job with health care benefits? I can tell you many times I would call my daughter, my son, after they got out of college and ask them about health insurance. And my daughter used to say, Dad, I don't need that now. I'll get it later. I feel just fine. Well, she never knew, and I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. So if we're going to give peace of mind to families, let's make sure that we think along the spectrum, along the continuum. Why would the Republican proposal today want to raise taxes on families with children, raise taxes on some 18 million families across America, those with kids? If they could find room for a tax break for the wealthiest, shouldn't they be able to include those families with kids? They may not be the wealthiest, but they are in many cases the neediest, and they are in many cases the most important for our future. And yet the Republican approach, the Hatch approach, is going to raise taxes on middle-income families with children. That is something that we never should allow to occur. Let me just say, this should be a simple vote for everyone in the Senate. Across the political spectrum, we ought to agree on two things. First, we need to cut taxes for middle-income and working families. And second, we should be responsible stewards of the federal budget, not leave a mountain of debt for our kids. Giving tax breaks to the wealthiest people and adding $900 billion to our national debt to do it is not responsible. So let's take this vote and show the American people that we stand with them and their values. We stand for cutting middle-class taxes and putting our debt on a sustainable path for recovery. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okonkwo. Mr. President,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
ask unanimous consent the call of quorum be terminated.
Without objection, the Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent that at 4 p.m. today, the cloture motion with respect to the motion to proceed to S3412 be withdrawn. The Senate adopt the motion to proceed to S3412, a bill extending the 2001, 2003, and 2009 tax cuts for 98% of Americans and 90% of all small businesses. That the only amendment in order to the bill be a substitute amendment offered by Senators McConnell and Hatch, which is identical to the text of S3413. That the amendment not be divisible. That the time until 4 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or their designates. Prior to vote on the McConnell-Hatch amendment, that upon disposition of the McConnell-Hatch amendment, the Senate proceed to vote on passage of the bill as amended, if amended. That there be no motion, points of order, or amendments in order to the amendment or the bill. That there be 2 minutes equally divided between the votes. Finally, Mr. President, that when the Senate receives a companion bill from the House providing for the extension of tax cuts as designated by the Majority Leader, it be in order for the Majority Leader to proceed to its immediate consideration, strike all after the enactment clause, and insert the text of S3412 as passed by the Senate in lieu thereof. That the House bill as amended be read a third time, statutory pay-go statement be read if needed, and the bill as amended be passed with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Republican Leader.
I would ask consent that the request be modified to strike the last paragraph, and further that it also be in order